Hi, everybody. This week we are going to be looking at Peter Singer's All Animals Are Equal. And so, just a little bit of background about Peter Singer. He was born in 1946, an Australian moral philosopher, teaches currently at Princeton University, and a laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. For Singer, essentially, he's going to ask the questions, are all animals equal? Or present this as opening questions for us to consider, right? Is there a difference between humans necessarily and other animals? And is there a difference between animals that are sentient, right? Maybe we might think that one thing that separates humans from other animals is our ability to rationalize, our sentience. But there would seem like there are definitely other animals that are sentient and can rationalize. And so, where really is going to be a difference in that? Are some animals not sentient? Can we look at, let's say, a chimpanzee and think, okay, well, a chimpanzee uses tools, is able to critically analyze a situation, able to hold relationships, and so it would seem like a chimpanzee is a very sentient creature. Is that the same for a spider? Is that the same for an ant? Is that the same for a giraffe? Um, and should we treat animals that are different or not sentient differently? So let's say we look at a dolphin, which we would consider to be a very sentient creature. Should we treat a dolphin different than something that may not have sentience, such as, I don't know, a goldfish, right? Or again, are all of these animals sentient beings? And so these are some questions that we're going to have to tackle and really understand in order to dive into the morality of um, equality with animals. And so Singer makes these distinctions essentially that humans don't really have vastly different qualities from other animals. And so there's nothing that really unifies us other than being in the group of Homo sapiens. And so when we think about that again, like what separates humans, we look back to old Greek philosophy text where Aristotle talks about the rational being, Plato talks about the rational being, and how humans have this characteristic or quality that is different from every other animal, right? We are the rational creature. But of course, we know that's not the case. Um, there are plenty of animals that are also rational. Again, there are plenty of animals that bury their dead, that um, mate for life, that use tools, that problem solve, right? Also, there are plenty of humans that don't do these things necessarily, right? We might look at someone who is mentally handicapped or have some sort of mental disease that prevents them from doing these things. We might look at someone, for instance, in a coma, and are we going to treat a person in a coma who doesn't have the ability to rationalize, isn't sentient? Are we going to treat that person differently than we are going to treat others? Or are we going to say, no, you're a member of our group, you're a Homo sapien, we are going to treat you the same as we would treat anybody? We're going to be equal under the eyes of the law, right? And so Singer's going to say that humans don't really have any qualities that an animal might not have, right? So again, humans can rationalize. Well, so can chimpanzees. Um, Humans can feel empathy. Well, so can elephants, right? Okay, well, maybe humans can. We've utilized tools to build these cities. Well, um, beavers can do very much the same thing, right? Utilizing tools in order to build structures. Um, and so when we think about something that really separates us, there really isn't going to be anything, right? And so what is it that separates us, and why should we treat animals differently or not equally to us? And so Singer's going to eventually say that there's no reason for moral consideration based on membership of a group, right? So that if the only thing that really distinguishes us is the fact that we're in this group of Homo sapiens, right, then when it comes to making moral decisions, that membership alone should not justify different action, right? Again, maybe if there was different qualities or characteristics. However, we know that this isn't necessarily the case. And so all we have is membership, and this should not be relevant. So ultimately, Singer suggests that if there is nothing distinguishing between humans and other animals, other than being part of Homo sapiens, then there should not be cause to treat unequally, or they're unequally on a moral scale, right? And we'll get into that in a little bit later, right? So when morality is in question, this distinction of being in one group versus another, being a Homo sapien, being an amphibian, being a mammal, being a fish, whatever, right? These groups that we have are meaningless when morality is in question. So if I'm not going to hurt another human, then I shouldn't hurt another member of another group, and so forth. Now, he does preface this with the idea that this doesn't mean that animals should be treated like humans, only that they warrant our moral consideration. So again, I'm not going to sit here and say, okay, well, all animals are equal because there's no defining characteristics that separates us. So we should probably have some more alligators in Congress. That makes sense, right? Clearly it doesn't, right? We're not going to say that everyone should be treated equally in this instance in terms of animals, because, as Singer states, animals have different interests. And so we should treat them morally based on their interests. So again, he's not saying that all sentient beings should be treated equally. This would be silly, right? We're not going to give everybody the same rights under the law as we do with chimps or that we do with cats. However, we are going to treat them morally in terms of the interests between, or we're going to treat them morally based on their particular interests. So again, different animals have different interests. So for instance, looking at my dog, who is down on the floor behind me, he has different interests. He is going to need to be treated differently than I would treat a human, right? For dogs, they're very much a pack animal. There needs to be an alpha. There needs to be a leader. So there's going to be treatment for my dog different than treatment for another human being. When I talk to my dog, typically in the form of commands, I'm not going to, well, I may speak to them like a human, but I obviously don't expect a response. I'm going to, again, treat my dog as though he needs to be led. He needs to know that I'm the alpha in the group. He needs to know the rules, right? Versus my neighbor, right? I'm not going to sit there and speak to my neighbor like I speak to my dog. I'm not going to assume that I'm the alpha in the neighborhood and that my neighbor needs to be led by me and requires that community, that pack, in order to maximize his potential and so forth. And so my dog is very much going to be treated very differently than others. Again, his needs are different. His needs are to be exercised, to be fed, to be loved, to be pet, to be brushed, right? And I'm not necessarily going to do all that with another human necessarily. Obviously, people need to be fed and loved and so forth, but my treatment is not going to be the same. And Singer doesn't believe that it should be. The treatment should be equal for the interests of that particular animal. And so we need to treat animals differently in terms of their interests, but on a moral level, they need to be treated equally. And so what that means is that we are going to hold animals in the same moral ground that we would hold anybody else. Which brings to question these certain difficult cases where our treatment of animals is a difficult choice to make based on their life or freedom and our safety and progress. So for instance, take drug testing. Should we use animals for drug testing? Now, Singer thinks that this is a difficult case. Some of you might think absolutely no, some of you might think absolutely yes, but it is a difficult case nonetheless, because I might think to myself, well, this animal's life, like we are sacrificing this animal's life for the cure of a potential disease. And so we have this very kind of utilitarian idea of, is the life of these animals the greatest good for everybody? Or are we just sacrificing these animals, right? Is it better to not test on an animal and not cure a deadly disease that will inevitably affect both, or should we do that? What Singer is saying is that we shouldn't sacrifice morality for triviality. So while we may think of animals in terms of treating them differently in difficult cases, it's the trivial cases that they should not be treated differently. And for Singer, he kind of gives a couple examples of what is trivial. So for instance, the excitement of sport, right? Hunting animals for sport, fishing for sport, right? These type of things are not moral behaviors that we should be conducting, because again, we're not treating the morality of the animals as a respected creature that has no, again, distinguishing characteristics necessarily from us, right? Singer also says even just the taste of meat, right? We are able to get our nutrition in other ways, right? We can be vegan, we can be vegetarian, and so we don't necessarily need the taste of meat. Decoration or comfort, again, do I need a bear-skinned rug? Do I need an elk's head on above my mantle? Right? These things are trivial, and these are just exerting dominance over an animal without moral regard to that animal's sentience and to the defining characteristics that both an animal and a human have. And so what Singer is essentially trying to get to is that we need to treat animals equally on a moral ground when it comes to trivial cases, and that there are still exceptions for these difficult cases that we just looked at. And that's something that we need to think carefully about. But the problem with Singer's morality versus triviality is the idea of what we consider to be trivial. So for instance, I may think that something is trivial that somebody else doesn't. In which case, right, we might have this ethical dilemma on our hands where our values collide. You might also have problems of distinguishing us from the rest of the animals. What happens in the future if we find out that perhaps we do have something that distinguishes us from the rest of the animals, right? Does that then give us a green light to treat animals differently? And just going back to the subjectivity of the triviality, right? Singer doesn't seem to give enough credit to the idea that when we say that something is trivial, that can be very subjective. I might think, for instance, that fishing for pleasure is trivial and it's just hurting the animal, while someone might think or need that as some sort of psychological or mental health activity. Or we might find instances where someone is allergic to certain plants, and that in order to get most proteins or most nutrients, they would have to eat some form of meat. And so we have these instances where, again, someone might consider something trivial that someone else doesn't. We have these difficult cases to deal with where we might think, is killing a dolphin or sacrificing a dolphin to defuse a bomb more important than the lives of people on a ship? And these questions are questions that Singer wants us to ask. These are questions that Singer is trying to get us to think more carefully about, instead of just saying, of course, an animal is different than us. Clearly, humans have built these cities and these social structures and all this. Look at what humans have done. And no animal has done anything like that. But is that the sort of thing that would distinguish us? And what really is it that distinguishes us if it's not sentience, if it's not rationality?